G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So, as always, if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let's get straight into my key deadline considerations in Jeddah. The first of which, before we engage in more limitless discourse, is how to preserve and maintain our cost cap heading into a very interesting juncture in F1 fantasy this season. As I've already covered off a little bit in my team selection video and seems to be demanding the attention of most fantasy content creators and enthusiasts out there, is the small number of budget drivers in the B tier that are likely to see some capacity of a price drop this weekend. Now, I've got the budget builder tool up on screen as always. Piastri and all of the A tier constructors look set for a price rise, most likely the maximum one. But as soon as we get into the B tier category, only Behrman and Hadjar seem to have half a shot at optimizing the maximum increase this week. 0.6 seems very achievable for both the Haas and the Racing Bulls driver. Everyone else may well be able to get a 0.2 up to maybe Esteban Ocon. Bortoleto probably not, but he also won't go down in price. And it just means that it's one of those weekends where preserving your cost cap or increasing it as much as possible could set you up for a nice rise. Now, there's discussion around which lineup is best based on that, but I think simply because of the fact so many drivers in the B tier which prop up our teams, especially those running McLaren, Mercedes, Piastri, or some variation of that, do seem likely to definitely not extract the maximum in terms of price gain that we probably have been accustomed to the last couple of weeks. So just something to think about. And I think for limitless users this weekend, worthwhile just considering how this positions your team for cost cap growth. As is the case, and as we know, you get the cost cap changes of your non-limitless team when you activate limitless. Now on the topic of limitless and what this means for Saudi Arabia specifically is overtakes. Now, Saudi Arabia, a very difficult track to navigate. DNFs the last couple of seasons haven't been quite as high as the 5 and the 6 DNFs we saw in 2021 and 2022, a pair in the last couple of years apiece. But much like DNFs, overtakes more recently have also been few and far between. Now, I've got stats and kind of how these overtakes stack up compared to all of the tracks on the racing calendar for that year. 2022, we saw Saudi Arabia 14th for overtakes, 16th in 2023, and last year, a paltry 52 overtakes to put them 21st out of 24 tracks. So that's why people are thinking about limitless, a low overtake track, but also somewhat of a DNF risk. And that's why I'm not so excited about using it for my team personally this weekend. I might throw it on the Team 3 just to experiment. But at the same time, it is still a tricky track. Inexperienced drivers can get caught out. And that's why with so many new rookies on the grid, an argument emerges for why limitless actually could be popular. You're kind of getting, as the former world number 2 Porsche F1 on Twitter talked about this week, the almost like quasi no negative. You're obviously not getting any DNF risk from no negative. You're pivoting into expensive and experienced drivers who may well be able to get through the race unscathed. The argument against the limitless, though, aside from DNF, it is counterintuitive because you can make the argument for any driver on the grid pretty much for DNFs, is that the template seems very well propped up based on McLaren, Mercedes, and Piastri. Now, if you went into a limitless team, you'd probably have all three of those assets, or certainly at least McLaren and Piastri, which is why using limitless doesn't scream to me as must use this weekend. Look, it might be the same in Miami, it might be the same in Imola, Monaco, etc., but you want to be as differential as possible. Ferrari and Red Bull are on the outer right now in F1 Fantasy. If they put in great practice times, they become front and center for limitless. And I think to that effect, it's not entirely clear to me who the best 4th, 5th drivers are on limitless as it stands right now. I think triple McLaren, George Russell, absolute locks. But then from there, where do we go? Max Verstappen, perhaps Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, I don't really know, but I think that's why there's, again, some nuances around how uncertain limitless feels right now and why, for me, Saudi Arabia doesn't quite scream to me as must-use territory. Now, quickly, just on constructors, again, some discussion around whether we should be going into Haas and George Russell as opposed to McLaren and budget drivers. I want to talk about this in my final thoughts for my team in just a second, but for me, I'm not so sure I'm ready to drink that Haas Kool-Aid again. I think 40 points was an outlier. They have looked very good, the best of the midfield teams in F1 Fantasy this season, but they're not going to score 40 points every week. And Kimi Antonelli, who obviously maybe didn't contribute as much to Mercedes, is also not going to finish that far down the order most weeks, I'm thinking. So that's why, for me, Haas off the menu for me, but again, a compelling budget building option if you're looking to use Limitless in Saudi Arabia. Quickly onto the asset tier ranking, and this is for non-Limitless teams. I think Limitless teams are a separate discussion. We can talk through that in all of about 10 seconds after this. But for me, Piastri firmly still the number one driver in the A tier, and George Russell for me, an excellent alternative if you're a little bit short on cash. George, an interesting stat for you, has the most front row starts among all drivers on the grid dating back to Brazil 2024. So I think that is an exceptionally good omen for someone who has outperformed the car. He's the best qualifier on the grid this season behind the McLaren duo. And I think, again, similar to Piastri at his price point, enables the double premium constructor pairing. Norris, Hamilton, Verstappen, all too expensive, and Kimi Antonelli, not sure I'm convinced he's a great 2x option. Now, into the B tier, again, Bam and Hadjar prioritized simply because of their low scoring thresholds for a max price rise, and I've got Bortoleto and Alonso in there as well. We talked about both of these drivers in my team selection video, so check that out. Very much a fan of Alonso with that experience and his recent history at this track. And then beyond that, it's kind of a bit of a scattershot approach for this weekend. I don't think any driver on the list here or not is going to see a max price rise, if at all any price rise for that matter. And I'm not entirely convinced you need to be taking trays and making swaps for one B tier for another if you've already got the foundations of two Haas drivers, Hadjar, and maybe a Bortoleto or a Doohan. You could easily switch the two of them out. Even Alonso's at a friendly price point. On the constructor front, wouldn't really go near any of them except for Haas this weekend. Maybe VCarb if they look good, because Hadjar has been the best qualifier among all drivers aside from those in the top four teams. So he's the 8th best qualifier this season, and just impressed by how this rookie continues to extract performance out of that Racing Bulls car every single race week. And then final team thoughts, again, Piastri for me, unlikely I go down the Limitless path, even though it is very much a consideration, and Piastri will be my 2x lock this weekend. Russell, as I said, an excellent qualifier, outperforming that Mercedes, and just not at all what I expected from him for a good reason this season. He's been excellent for Mercedes. So not on my menu, but I think, as I said, if you're strapped for cash, he's a great alternative to Oscar Piastri. No weather concerns at all this weekend, and I personally think that will hopefully mean rookie drivers are less of a concern in the desert. Qualifying, as always, on the Saturday for non-sprint weekends at the later time than what would ordinarily be the sprint race deadline. So I've got the budget builder up. Actually want to look at my team selection. Quite a few dilemmas, and I do want to unpack Haas as the constructor. Now, this is what my team is at the moment. We talked about team selection. I was looking at 2 transfers this week, but I actually think, and this was an idea planted by Tom Poppanman F1, is to potentially just have one transfer this week. Bring in either Fernando Alonso or Gabriel Bortoleto. I'm probably leaning towards the Brazilian just because he cannot go down in price. And the reason I want to have potentially 3 free transfers heading into Miami is if for whatever reason I choose not to activate Limitless, then having the flexibility to maneuver my team to set up for the sprint race weekend will be obviously beneficial. Now, if I use Limitless in Miami, I obviously lose all of the transfers I rolled up to that point. It would be one transfer loss, not ideal, but at the same time, I'd love to have this flexibility heading into the sprint race weekend. If I do obviously choose to go down the Limitless path, having Bortoleto there who cannot lose value over a sprint race Limitless use would also be invaluable to preserving cost cap. Now, I obviously talked about Fernando Alonso. He's not entirely off the table for me either. I like this lineup right here. As I said, I could also just do a 1-for-1 swap take out Doohan, put in Fernando Alonso. I think Jack's more than likely going to fall in price this weekend, so an easy make way for me. But I think this is kind of where I could see my team going, the direction of it at least. And as I said, if I don't go down the Ocon for Alonso swap, I may well just stick with this, have that extra transfer heading into Miami. Now, I want to talk about the Haas constructor and what that kind of viability means for building budget this season or at this point in the season. Now, I can't get to George Russell. I think a lot of teams could actually squeeze Russell in here. Let's, for argument's sake, take out Ocon, put in Russell, and then it doesn't really matter what this other driver is. Let's just put in Gabriel Bortoleto. It could be anyone below Ocon though. So kind of what my 2 cents is on this team. Now, I think for building budget, it's perfectly fine to own, but we are now heading into the 5th race of the season in Saudi Arabia, and we definitely learned from Bahrain that the McLaren Mercedes Piastri lineup is far superior for points than, say, a Piastri McLaren Haas Russell or something like that. The only reason Haas did as well as they did in Bahrain was because both drivers, starting further back, racked up a bunch of overtakes at a high overtake circuit. We're going into quite the opposite in Saudi Arabia. There will be very few overtakes. Behrman, who leads the grid in positions gained this season, will not be feasting the same way he has done recently. And I'm just very skeptical that this kind of lineup, sure, it's great for building budget, but we're already seeing teams that are in the top 1,000 in the world, and Tom Popham Man had a really good section in his video about this. Teams that might be 1,000, so maybe 1 million or 2 million short in cost cap, are still inside the top 2,000, top 1,000 in the world. I've got a team sat here in the hundreds of thousands, and I'd take that top 2,000 rank any day for $2 million less. And I think most of you watching this would do the same. Now, that's why I'm just not so inclined to go down the Haas Russell route this weekend. I think if you've got Haas already from Bahrain, then it's probably a different discussion, but I wouldn't be going back into Haas and then back out again for the sprint race weekend. I think it's just, for me personally, not the best use of transfers. Transfers are and continue to be at a premium. And as I said, I want that flexibility in Miami if I have 3 free transfers and don't go down limitless to pivot into some other lineup of my own choosing that weekend. So look, I understand the argument. And going back to the budget building, you can see Haas, a very low threshold for a maximum price rise. But George may get 31 points, he may not. I think for him, 20 to 30 is probably about normal unless he bags a fastest lap or something like that. And I think he could get 0.1. But if you went for, let's say, George Russell and Haas, so let's call it 0.1 plus 0.6 is 0.7. But I do think you're taking a haircut on the points. Plays someone like Bortoleto, who I think his ceiling is about 5 points, won't drop in value. But you're going with, let's say, Mercedes for a 0.3. So let's say you get 0.3 versus 0.7. But Mercedes, I believe, are outscoring Russell and Haas almost every day of the week, especially on a sprint race week, especially in Saudi Arabia where overtakes are low. So look, I'm not going to dismiss this lineup, but it kind of just goes back to the point of how long are we willing to sacrifice on points to build budget? Is 0.5 million at the end of the season going to make that much of a difference? I'm not so sure it is. So anyway, that's my thought process around my team selection and why, again, even if I did burn a transfer heading into Miami, if I rolled one, let's say, so I have an Ocon there and then I have Gabriel Bortoleto. Like if I burn one and activate limitless, so be it. It's better to have, for me personally, the flexibility. I've got wildcard coming out the other side if I need to use it as well. And then look, if I don't have the desire to use limitless in Miami, then I use it in Imola or I use it in Monaco. Both tracks I'm very much seriously also considering. And so that's why having 3 free transfers gives me, again, the option to pivot into budget building assets. The thresholds are going to be lower after a sprint because more drivers in the midfield will score more points. We saw that happen after China as well. And so that's why, for me personally, the flexibility around chip heavy weekends is going to be essential, I think, for kind of strategizing how we build budget, and how we score points. So that's pretty much my 2 cents. As I talked about in my team selection video, Ferrari again could be on the menu. I wouldn't discount them entirely. I think if you can get to them with a lineup like this, perfectly fine. If you can't, then you could do something like Bortoleto and I think Fernando Alonso, as I talked about in my team selection. Red Bull, I'm not entirely convinced yet. I'd need to see more from Max and Yuki, but both of them don't seem all that comfortable with the car as it stands. So you could go down this path if I want a differential constructor in Ferrari that is improving every single race week since their disqualification. But I think that's about the extent to which I would pivot into a different lineup for this weekend. Do want that flexibility heading into Miami. So that's my final thoughts for this week, guys. I will be back with another deadline stream, as always, 2 hours before qualifying this Saturday. So do drop by for that. They have been exceptional as always, but I will leave it there for now, guys. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.